Hello, Pastor Will here again for our devotional for today, Monday, June 15th, 2020. Now, yesterday we looked at Genesis, the flood story, and we looked at Psalm 46, where we see the psalmist singing that God opposes war and anything that has to do with war, and that's the only way to peace. And we looked at Matthew 7, the conclusion of what's commonly called the Sermon on the Mount, and then we looked at a little bit briefly Paul's words at the beginning of Romans, where he says he's not ashamed of the gospel. So today we're going to ask ourselves why we're ashamed of the gospel. And we do not live in the gospel, but choose another way that will never end in peace, but will only end in destruction and despair. Why don't we believe in God? We're going to continue with the theme today that Jesus expects the church to live by the model of his own life and teachings. And we're going to look at the Sermon on the Mount just as a focus on what Jesus teaching. Just that alone, just those couple of chapters to help us focus on Jesus's teachings. And if the church just lived by that alone, the world would be an entirely different place. You know, it's funny that you can find the 10 Commandments on the wall in almost any church building, but you will not find the Sermon on the Mount. Why is that? The Sermon on the Mount is where the rubber meets the road. It's who we are called to be, how we are called to live. But we don't want that. Many times in my life as a pastor, I have had parishioners become upset with me when I say, the whole Bible is not to be taken literally. There are stories that are told to help us come to a greater truth. But the stories themselves are not necessarily so. And they become outraged. Oh, you're supposed to take the Bible literally. Take all parts of the Bible literally. And I said, well, yes, not all parts, but some parts, such as the Sermon on the Mount. That is to be taken literally. We are supposed to love our enemies. We are supposed to welcome the stranger. We are supposed to pray for those who hate us. We are not supposed to retaliate with violence and all these things. And then they say, oh, no, that part's not to be taken literally. That's impossible. Well, is it impossible? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We say out of one side of our mouth, and out of the other side of our mouth, well, we can't do that. Well, why can't we? Why? Are we ashamed of the gospel? Is that the problem? We just don't want to not fit in with the rest of society who's saying this is the way things are and always have been, and you're crazy if you think that's going to work. A lot of people say that it's not possible to live without war. And I'm going to say, okay, perhaps that's so. Let's just say that is so. It's impossible to live without war. However, it is possible for the church to refuse to support war in any form. That is possible, but it requires us changing our priorities. I read about a peace activist who died last week, and she disagreed with any form of violence, and her life reflected it. And she protested against it in protest, of course, but also in the way she lived. And one of the ways she lived was she chose to live at the poverty level so that she could not produce any income that could be taxed and those monies used for war. Now that's commitment. And she might have lived at the poverty level, but she was supported by a greater community. And she didn't live a bad life at all. She had a very good life. And that's possible for the church. Just think if the church together said, we're not going to support violence anymore, whether it's a military violence or a police violence against people, we're not going to support that. Now, our nation is supposedly founded on religious freedom and Christian religious freedom. So why do we support these things that Jesus calls evil? Why? So we're going to talk a little bit about resistance today and the difference between nonviolent resistance and violent resistance. And the church is called to nonviolent resistance. We are called to resist. We are not supposed to conform to this world, but to be like Jesus. And Jesus resisted. It cost him his life, and it's going to cost us our lives too. But through God we can live. So let's look at that nonviolence resistance. There is a woman named Erica Chenoweth. I don't know how you pronounce her name, She was a PhD student back in 2006, and she was going to write a thesis on how effective strategic logic armed resistance is. And she believed that throughout history, there were times with armed resistance made great political change possible. And she believed that terrorism and civil war and revolution were required to achieve major social and political change. That's what she believed, and she went into her thesis with that belief. And then one day she went to a workshop on nonviolent resistance. And this workshop just changed her. And she said, well, does nonviolent resistance work? Is it effective? Wouldn't it be great if nonviolent resistance actually worked? And she discovered over a 2-year study that nonviolent resistance was more effective than violent resistance. And she compiled a database of all violent and nonviolent campaigns from the year 1900 to 2006 that resulted in the overthrow of governments. And she compiled a database of 323 mass actions and 160 different variables that had an impact on these things. And then discovered through this process of study of actual history, the study of history, that nonviolent civil resistance is far more effective than violence to producing change. One of the earliest forms of nonviolent resistance of which I'm aware happened in the time of Pontius Pilate in Judea and in Jerusalem, when Pilate was allowing the Roman soldiers to come in, and they had their standards, and they would bear their standards, their flags that represented their their regiment, whatever, but it represented war and it represented Rome. And they set these up on the temple. And the religious leaders said, no, you can't do this. This is the temple. This is a sacred space. This is not for that. And Pilate said, tough. And so the religious leaders came out and set up in the temple and said, we're not going to leave until you take these away. And Pilate said, well, I'm not going to take them away. I'll kill you if I have to. And so they all kneeled down and they bared their neck. And they said, well, then kill us. We're not going to strike back, and we're not going to leave. And they won. Pilate had the soldiers withdraw from the temple, and they won. That's one of the earliest cases of nonviolent resistance I'm aware of. There are others. Dr. King, of course, taught nonviolent resistance and lived it, and it cost him his life. One of the criticisms against nonviolent resistance and against Dr. King was that for nonviolent resistance to work, the one who is the oppressor has to have a conscience. They have to care about people. They have to see that the ones who are resisting nonviolently, never passively, but nonviolently, are being hurt, and their children are being hurt, and it's not just, and it hurts their conscience, and they change. And people said to Dr. King, you're dealing with a group of people, racist, white supremacists and the like, who have no conscience, and they will never change. And of course, that was 60 years ago, and we're still dealing with that lack of change now. So there is some merit to that criticism that they have no conscience. A case I can recall in history where that is illustrated is when the Cherokee decided to resist the United States nonviolently. You know this in your history? The Cherokee decided to nonviolently resist and stand up for their rights, but not with violence. And what did the United States government do? They slaughtered them. We slaughtered them. We killed them. And then we put them on the Trail of Tears and killed them some more. Hitler learned, we condemn the Japanese for the Bataan Death March and this and all that, and we condemn Hitler, but we don't like to realize, if we read our history, we know that Hitler gained many insights in setting up his concentration camps and his killing of so many people from the U.S., the way the U.S. dealt with Native Americans. Yeah. And so if people don't have a conscience and you're trying to resist them without violence, it's not going to end well for you. That's a fact. But it didn't stop Jesus from still not retaliating. Remember, he said he could call down legions of angels, but he didn't do it to stop his death. He went ahead with it because he trusted God. He trusted God. He was not ashamed of the gospel. So this student, this PhD student, Erica, she said that for nonviolent resistance to work, it requires four things. First of all, it requires a large and diverse population that is prepared for the long haul of resistance. They're sustained. They're prepared to support each other with food and medicines and, psychological support, money, whatever it takes for at least 11 to 18 months, because nonviolent resistance takes a long time. It's not going to be a flash in the pan. Another thing that's required is that there needs to be a shift in loyalty from security forces. The military or police forces that are in charge and used to doing things are going to be going after you. They have to shift their focus from supporting the oppressor to realizing that those being oppressed are human and do not need to be treated so brutally. The third thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a lot of variation in their methods. You don't just protest. You may also stop shopping at certain places. You will no longer support racist businesses, let's say in the civil rights movement. You will no longer vote into office racist and haters, things like that. And then the fourth thing that's required is do not, under any circumstances, descend into chaos or violence. This is what the oppressors want. They want you to act like them because they know how to handle that. They know how to fight. They're going to kill you. And if they can look tough and look, who are these guys walking around going into state capitals such as Kentucky, all dressed up with their military paraphernalia on, these civilians that are all tough? They want to fight. It makes them feel tough and macho, I guess. And if you fight them, they have a good reason to fight you, and then they can claim I was defending myself. Don't descend into that. Keep to the plan. Do not resort to violence. Those are the four things that bring about change through nonviolent resistance. And so to protest nonviolently is to make yourself vulnerable. And this is part of the very essence of taking up the cross and following Jesus for the Christian, for the follower of Christ. We understand we're called to be vulnerable. This is nothing new. We may be hurt. Yes, that's right. This is a part of loving others. And then second, of course, and then as I talked about, preparation. But I'm getting ahead of myself or behind myself. So an example that in an interview I saw with Miss Erica, an example she gave, a more modern example, was the end of apartheid in South Africa. One of the ways that this finally ended after years of resistance and protest was that the black folk said we will no longer support any businesses owned by white people. And the black folk were still working and making their income, and they were only supporting black businesses, no white businesses. Well, the white businesses started to fail, or at the very least weren't as profitable. And so they start to complain to the government, wait a minute, something's got to change here because we're not making the money we're used to making and we need. And so this led people to the tables to talk, and one thing led to another, and apartheid was outlawed, and everything changed. But it took a long time of people working together and resisting together. Now, another thing that Miss Erica discovered in her studies is that nonviolent campaigns are 10 times likelier to transition to democracy within 5 years than our violent campaigns. Now, we should know this as Americans. How long was the violent campaign known as the American War in Vietnam, known as the Vietnam War in America? It was over 10 years, right? About 10 years? Did anything happen? Did anything good happen as of it? No. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives lost overseas, and almost 60,000 American lives lost. For what? So that arms dealers could make money. How about the war that started because of the lies about Iraq? 20 years on, that war and everything that happened because of that still hasn't been concluded. For what good? The only ones who've made any money out of it are politicians and arms dealers. What good has it done? None. Not any good at all. violent campaign is never good. But even when nonviolent campaigns failed, they often lead to longer term reforms than do violent ones. Now, that's a short, very brief history on the benefits of nonviolent resistance. Now we're going to talk about something else that goes in hand with it, or can. And that is, what percentage of the population does it take to overthrow oppression? There's a TED Talk on this. I don't remember which one it is. Just look it up. Look up the 3.5% rule. It takes 3.5% of a population to affect radical change. Our country has over 300 million people. 3.5% of that is roughly 11.5 million people. If 11.5 million people supported one another in the ways that Miss Erica discussed, long-term nonviolent resistance, saying we're not going to support anything that has to do with oppression, nothing that has to do with oppression, nothing. No funding going to oppression, no funding going to war, no funding going to brutal police tactics, none of that. Supporting one another. If, I'll just say 12 million Americans did that, we would see a massive change. Now, I'm a pastor in the United Methodist Church. How many United Methodists do you think there are in America? Guess what? There are 12 million United Methodists in America. How many Christians are there in America? 240 million. It's the biggest population of Christians in the world. If only 10% of the Christians in America, 24 million, joined together and said, we're going to be Christ-like instead of American-like, imagine the change. No more fighting and violence and supporting violence. Teachers would have enough supplies to teach their children. Children would have enough food to eat. Medical care would be taken care of for everyone. I mean, my God. Why doesn't the church act like Christ? In our present situation, in the midst of a pandemic and racial disharmony, we have a wonderful opportunity as the church to affect positive change, love. We have several of the things going on that Erica advises are a part of a successful nonviolent campaign. Many in our National Guard units are refusing to attack American citizens who are peacefully protesting. Many of our top military officials are refusing to be a part of that. They recognize that it's wrong. We see a shift in the loyalty of security forces. That's a plus. We need to support one another. What if we joined together and just started talking and supporting one another financially and don't support businesses that do not allow, that are racist. I see on Facebook every day people calling out racist. That attorney up in, in Wisconsin or something, who was spitting on that young black man. People are calling her out and saying, we're not going to put up with this. There's several businesses around here where I live in Alabama. Alabama. Can you believe it? Me in Alabama. They're racist. They have a right to be racist, but they don't have a right to hurt other people. And people are saying don't support their businesses, and we as the church should not support their businesses in any way, shape, or form. I've been reading about businesses that do not allow their first of all, make their employees come to work during a pandemic. We should support these employees and help them. They shouldn't have to go to work during a pandemic. No one should. I see businesses who will not let their employees wear masks. These businesses should not be supported. I see employees who make their employees wear masks, won't allow them to wear masks that say Black Lives Matter. These businesses should not be supported. I see businesses who make their employees wear masks that say a political candidate on the mask. I'll use one I've seen. Trump, vote for Trump 2020. These businesses should not be supported. Should not be. When is the church going to step up and stop being ashamed of the gospel? That's the question for us as the people of God. Are we ashamed of the gospel? It's time for the church to either fish or cut bait. Do you trust in God or not?